I'm a resident of Andover, and my lovely wife is a naturalized citizen from a Muslim majority country. So we may not even have met in Donald Trump's America, but we were lucky. So we have two fine sons, both grad students, one at Oxford and one at MIT. So doing fusion research at MIT, so keep your fingers crossed. My main reason for getting in the race is I really want my party back. I remember 40 years ago when I think things went off the rails and Democrats started to take more and more corporate money. It was a bad thing. It was a very bad thing for our party. And I was organizing at the time for the Textile Workers Union. And I was hesitant to tell workers that the federal government protected their right to organize, because this company, J.P. Stevens, we were trying to organize, it was a model for the movie Norma Ray, proved that the boss could fire with impunity those leaders in the factory and just stop an organizing campaign in its tracks. So 1977 we fought for labor law reform just to get the National Labor Relations Act back to where it was, where you really did protect the workers' right to organize. Well, we lost. We lost. Why? Because the Senate was filibustered. The conservatives filibustered for 5 weeks to stop that legislation. And finally, the president of the Senate said, we got to move on. And it was a very modest goal, really, just to protect the right to organize. And look, I've then went abroad for the AFL-CIO, about 6 different foreign assignments, mostly in Asia, over about a 9-year period. And I saw different economies, and I saw where our jobs went. Those jobs that left America, it wasn't because of bad trade deals, as Donald Trump would have you believe. When they invented that shipping container, that's when those jobs left. Because when those businesses that could exploit cheap labor had that shipping container, they were gone. So, I really think we've got some positive stories in this district. In Lawrence, for example, making New Balance shoes in Lawrence. Jim Davis bought that company when it was, on its back 40 years ago or so. And he chooses to make shoes in America. Anybody here know why he can do it? Because he doesn't have shareholders. It's a closely held corporation, so he doesn't answer to Wall Street and answer to the analysts at, the Wall Street Journal and other publications. So he's free. He's free to make some shoes in America, some shoes in the UK, and that's a good thing. Also, this suit from Haverhill. They make these suits at Southwick factory. The union I used to work for is in that factory, 500 or 600 workers, making a good salary and some benefits. And, these are the jobs that we have to reshore some of these jobs. We have to get incentives to corporations to come back with some of these jobs, because these jobs are wanted. They're good jobs. They're not, just because they're low skilled doesn't mean they're not desirable for a lot of Americans. So that's one thing I would love to do, is get involved in that kind of incentivizing. But we're so far away from being able to do anything in the Congress because of the opposition from the Republicans and conservatives, and we've just lost the mojo, I think, is the best word. And part of it is just because we're not vocal enough. There's a company right down the road here in Ayer. 2011, its biggest customer stole its wind turbine technology. And what happened? They went from 900 employees to 200, almost overnight. It's a Chinese company, and only last January they were found guilty in a federal court, the first ever criminal intellectual property theft case of a Chinese company ever, last January. Do you think anybody in Congress from the House caucus said, well, maybe we should have the CEO and an engineer and some workers down to Washington have a press conference, because the Republicans have so demonized government and regulation for 40 years that they have Americans believing that the government doesn't work. I will be vocal if I go to Washington. I will have that press conference, and I will say, this is why we have the Economic Espionage Act of 1995. This is why we have it, just because of cases like this. Now, This company suffered damages up to $800 million, that federal court said last January. But they settled just recently for $57 million. 800 million was the damage, and they settled for 57 million. Donald Trump should have brought the hammer down, because he was saying that he was going to do intellectual property theft was a front burner issue for him. Well, if so, why didn't he squeeze that Chinese government? Because this is partially Chinese-owned company that was stealing our technology. They were so brazen, they sold this technology back to the Commonwealth. There's a turbine, wind turbine in Charlestown that had the technology in it. So there's just too much impunity. And so, one thing I would be in favor of is a corporate crime database at the Department of Justice, because so many American corporations have just operated with complete impunity and without regard to the best interests of our country. And Walmart, for example, look what Bain Capital did. Do you know the story? Bain Capital leverage buyout, $5 billion they borrowed, and they dumped that $5 billion debt on Walmart, and it crushed them. Walmart couldn't improve its stores, it couldn't improve its online presence, and so 33,000 jobs lost because of Bain Capital, which made a $50 million in fees from that leverage buyout of Toys R Us. 33,000 jobs lost. So, these are the kind of things that we've got to, we can't be so accepting of the way things are. Look what Walmart did. Walmart bribed officials in Mexico. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning story in the Wall Street, in the New York Times. For 7 years, tens of millions of dollars, bribing officials to speed up construction permits. And a couple of pension funds, union pension funds, sued the board of directors of Walmart and said, why were you asleep at the switch? Why didn't you know that your company was spending this kind of money and bribing officials in Mexico? And the court in Delaware said, oh, that's all right. They don't need to know. That's not their responsibility. Again, if I was on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, I would have a press conference and invite those unions down to Washington and say, look, this is a travesty. This company deserves to be punished and probably pay the shareholders, like these pension funds, some kind of compensation for their malfeasance. So I would just like to tell you that in addition to the corporate crime database at the Department of Justice, I would also like to reestablish the Division of Economic Research at the National Labor Relations Board, because in the 40s and 50s we had this after the Wagner Act was passed. And we've got to know what jobs are coming in the future, and how to train our young people for these jobs, and be ready, because our businesses aren't going to do it. Our family lived in Europe also for 3 or 4 years, so I know different kinds of capitalism. I know in Germany, businesses take this responsibility to look down the road, train their workforce, and they know. But we're so short-term oriented in the United States that our businesses don't do that. They're just looking for the next quarter's profits, and that's why we can't make any real progress. And one thing I'll leave you with is just, I was shocked by this. Maybe I shouldn't be. I feel like very naive sometimes. But did you know a year ago that 60% of House Democrats voted for a defense budget $50 billion higher than Donald Trump was asking for? House Democrats, 60% voted for this. This is just a cynical move on their part to curry favor with the defense industry, with the contractors, with the contributors. We've got to get our government out of the corporate hands. And, I'm the one who's going to go down there and say, look, the jig is up for some of these businesses. And the way you do it, I think, is you just embarrass not only the sitting members, but the corporations. And as Lori said, we did it with the tobacco companies. It has been done. And I think it just takes a focused organizer's approach. I was an organizer for 40 years. And the reason you knew about Nike sweatshops is because I quit a job that I loved. I was abroad for the AFL-CIO. It's the best job in the labor movement as far as I'm concerned. But I quit that job after I saw what they were doing in Indonesia. I said, I'm going to take this story back to Americans and see if they're okay with $70 pair of shoes and $1 labor costs and workers getting slapped around in the process. I quit a job I loved. I used my 401k for 5 years to take this story back to America. And that's the kind of organizer, that's the kind of persistence that you're going to get with me if you send me to Washington. So I'd be happy to take any questions from you all.
Thank you. Any questions, Jeff?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm curious to know which Democrats you really like and you relate to who are in Washington now.
Bernie?
Right?
Bernie's pretty good.
Bernie?
There's
Is there anybody who doesn't like Bernie?
Well, there are people, you know, but, well, I think Joe Kennedy was right to stand up for those workers. I think it was the General Electric factory that was going to offshore some work. So I think Elizabeth Warren is great and outspoken, you know, really kind of a model for the kind of Democratic Party I'm talking about, is where you're, you know, something happens and you speak out on it, you know, but it's just, you know, you can't be passive. And I think that's what I fight the most, is the passivity. I don't know, maybe they're all too distracted dialing for dollars, but I would say, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie were right up there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, this has been very interesting. I think I've heard everybody, but
We have 2 more in August.
2 more in August. We'll get 2 more.
Just when you thought it was over.
But of people that I've heard, you are the union guy.
Yeah.
And that's quite refreshing, actually. But it seems to me that unions are on the downside of the hill. I mean, there must have been on the bell curve an apex, probably in the 50s or 60s. I'm not sure what you would say it was. And the AFL-CIO was certainly the top dog, as far as my understanding. But with court decisions and so forth, I don't know where the union movement goes, and I don't know how you recapture the hearts of the American workers, and particularly how the Democratic Party recaptures the hearts of American workers. Because obviously, somewhere in this past election, we didn't get the message out. Now, Joe Biden, I think, is the one closest in kind of connecting, but the unions were always the heart of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, one guy who gets it is Sherrod Brown gets it, and you know, he's a very good representative on labor stuff and on the trade agreements. And let me say that it's not as bleak a picture. I'm usually the dark view of things, but public employee unions are not in the same shape that, you know, the manufacturing unions are in. So there's some hope that even with this Janus decision from the Supreme Court, that might actually, you know, spur them into, you know, real activism. I've been watching the AFT convention, the American Federation of Teachers convention this week, and there's a lot of, you know, enthusiasm, you know, to try and hold that all together. So. So
you would want to increase manufacturing in Massachusetts?
Oh, definitely. Any jobs that can be brought back here. I think that, you know, look, take a Spanish example. There's the biggest apparel company on the planet is Inditex. Zara is the brand name, and they're not very much in the U.S., but the biggest in the world. They're making 60 or 70% of their clothes in Western Europe. You know, they're not paying under 800 euros a month for these workers. So, you know, how can they do this? They do it. They choose to do it, and they're growing, and they're, you know, they're still selling. You know, obviously they're the biggest in the world. So I think we can do this. It's just a matter of will. And to get back to the union question, I mean, it's been a long slide downward, but you know, we can expand the base. I would think, why don't farm workers have a right to organize? You know, maybe we would have better, you know, jobs if farm workers could organize. The only reason we had Cesar Chavez was that the California legislature decided they wanted to let farm workers organize. But I think there's, you know, there's great hope in the fast food field, because these workers are very active. And did you see the latest thing? The Attorney General in Washington State took these chains to task for anti-poaching agreements. They wouldn't let one Carl's Jr. hire from another Carl's Jr. employee because this suppresses wages. You see, so that's why I think we need this corporate crime database, because corporations have their lawyers staying up nights thinking about how to keep wages down and how to keep workers from organizing. And I just think it's not, we should be, as a country, as a society, moving forward. And now what do we have? We have retrenchment on labor rights. We have voter suppression. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that, Americans are suffering through this, getting out of this recession, and we can't lift our wages. We have to work 2 jobs. And, when Donald Trump says the economy's never been better, I don't think he knows what most Americans, that can't afford health care are thinking about. So.
Thank you, Jeff. Did you have any literature or anything you want to?
Yeah, I'll leave something on the table. Thank you very much.
Contact
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
thank